Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Canadian Multifamily Investing Insider Blog. I'm Pierre-Paul Turgeon, your host, Canada's Multifamily Investing Authority. As many of you know, former insider. I used to be Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation multifamily underwriter, even worked in default management and real estate at CMHC. And of course, I'm a full-time multifamily investor myself with a portfolio of properties worth over 20, I don't know, maybe Gary can tell me how much my properties are worth now, but probably over $24 million, 136 doors. I'm super stoked to bring you today Gary Smith from the Canadian Valuation Group, people that every year I work with. And to be honest with you, today's the first day I see Gary face to face. We've been speaking over the years. And you know, I kept asking him, one of these days we got to do an interview for my vlog, and here we are. So Gary has some pretty interesting credentials. He's the owner and president and CEO of, as I said, the Canadian Valuation Group. They're a Western Canada property tax consultant agency, which specializes obviously in multifamily, commercial retail, shopping centers, industrial warehousing, development land, and office towers. CVG, and I'm reading this from your bio, Gary. CVG's client-focused collaboration and hands-on approach has driven them to handle more than $5.8 billion worth of real estate assets, including $1.2 billion worth of multifamily assets in 2023. Gary is a loving husband, proud father of two girls, an avid backcountry hiker like me. We'll talk about that a little bit because he just came back from Patagonia. And of course, he can be found on LinkedIn, and their webpage is CanadianValuationGroup.com. And right off the bat, I want to say that, Gary, I'm super stoked to be talking to you and seeing you for the first time, literally today, because we talk at this time of year. This is being recorded in February when we get our tax assessments. And Gary, in consultation with my property manager, will figure out whether we need to appeal some of these assessments that we just got in the last few weeks. Gary, why don't we start there? So that's the basis for our relationship. And to be honest with you, after reading your bio, I'm thinking you and I are probably going to do more business together. Before I go any further, I should mention, see, it's funny, Gary, I did not even mention to the folks now listening that I'm now a mortgage broker myself. Okay. So hence, my point I was about to make, that I think Gary and I will be working a lot more together, because you guys, although you're Western based, you don't just work in Alberta. Is that true, Gary? You work in other provinces as well?
Oh, yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we're primarily Western Canada focused right now, but we are creeping into Manitoba, Ontario, and then a couple of properties in the Maritimes right now.
Okay, so that gives me the ability. See, I'm used to introducing myself for my vlog, but I forget that I'm a licensed mortgage broker like you, specializing specifically in commercial residential, so apartment buildings and construction. So, and I'm licensed in Ontario as well, Alberta, and very soon in British Columbia. So Gary, you and I touch base every year. Usually the process, I don't necessarily always get involved. My property manager, they talk to you, and when they get the tax assessment, they relay those to you. Can you tell us a little bit that process about this tax appeal that multifamily owners like myself can do?
Definitely. Yeah, and I guess I'll just start by saying thanks for inviting me here today. Super excited as well to have this chat. Like you mentioned, we have some great topics to go through. I'll do my best to keep it a little bit upbeat and exciting. My wife typically jokes that when she has trouble sleeping, I just start talking about tax appeals and what it means, and then within a few minutes she's fast asleep. So what a lot of people don't realize when they get their assessment notice is you can do something about that particular number. And you have 75%, I'd say, of the population just gets that notice, and they say, "Hey, my property's going up in value. That's good. If I were to sell it, I'd get this value from a purchaser." And some people look at it and say, "I don't know what the city's thinking. They're way out to lunch, but at least I'm not paying as much as I think it's worth." Now, what we typically advocate for when you get that assessment notice is ask yourself two questions. The first question is, if someone came up to me and offered what the city is assessing it as, would you take the money and run, or would you go tell that person to fly a kite? And if it's, go fly a kite, you're probably underassessed and you're probably not thinking too much about that particular valuation. Now, if you're in the former group, take the money and run, there's a good chance that the city is seeing something within the marketplace that's overinflating your assessment valuation. Now, why that is important, because the property tax that you owe corresponds with that valuation. And so when you get that assessment amount, fast forward 3 months later, you're going to get a tax letter in the mail saying, hey, you're going to owe us this much money. And when people get that tax bill and they realize their assessment went up, which means they're paying more property tax, they get a little bit into panic mode, say, why am I paying so much property tax? And then, they give us CVG a call and saying, hey, CVG, what can you do about my property taxes? I was paying, 50,000 last year. Now I'm paying $60,000. What's going on? So I guess from a high level perspective, what we ultimately do is look at how the city arrived at that particular valuation. Now, I won't get into the weeds in terms of all the parameters. I will mention that as a property owner, when you get that valuation notice, you can request the details behind those calculations. So if you have a low-rise multifamily property and you get your assessment notice, let's say it comes in at $1.4 million, you're like kind of scratching your head a little bit saying, what is the city thinking here? Like I might be able to sell it for, 1.3, maybe 1.2. What are they seeing within their modeling to come up with that valuation? So upon request, the city actually has to give you the rental rates they're using, the expenses, the tenant inducements, and what they're ultimately arriving at from an effective gross income, and then the income multiplier that they're using to arrive at the valuation.
So-called the mill rate, right? That also called mill rate, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of, I guess, sort of moving pieces and we'll get, if your viewers would think of benefit, we can get a little bit more into the weeds of the appeal process. But from a starting point, what is typically important is looking at that valuation and saying, does this make sense? Does this align with kind of what you're feeling within the marketplace? Now, depending on where you are within the nation, there's different assessment cycles. So if you look at sort of Western Canada, BC and Alberta, it's an annual cycle. So every year you get a new assessment notice, and it's based on sales from previous years. And it just keeps on moving down the timeline year after year. Now, if you look at sort of the Central Prairie, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, they're on a 3-year cycle. The next one is 2025. And when you look at Ontario, and this is where I'm going with all this, is that they're on a 4-year assessment cycle. But in August 2023, the government passed the Assessment Act got extended so that there's going to be no reassessment years until the end of 2024. So ultimately,
well, we could dive into that a little bit. I can suspect why that is, but a little bit of price inflation over the last little while. I guess it's getting a bit excessive, right?
Yeah, well, what is interesting, and at least I find interesting, is that right now in Ontario, the valuations that you receive are based on 2016 sales. And so come 2025, they're going to be based on the last 4 years worth of sales. So you can
Wow.
imagine people who bought multifam in 2016 in Ontario, what they're being assessed at right now, and what they're probably going to be assessed at next year.
Whew.
When you're not being assessed at 2016 numbers, you're going to be being assessed at 2023, 2024 numbers. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see how that relates in terms of their modeling, and how
Wow.
much of these values are going to be going significantly higher than what they are right now as a result of this Assessment Act coming into completion at the end of 2024.
Some people are going to get some pretty sour surprises in the mail, eh?
Yeah.
You know what? Let's go there. I mean, this is so. In case you don't know, Gary, I'm very opinionated. I read a lot. I'm also hooked up with the market in Ontario as well. We have what we call a housing crisis in this country. To me, it's way beyond that. And the one that's put it best is Benjamin Tull, the CIBC economist, great economist, it's an emergency in Canada. I believe that this is one of the biggest challenges this country faces for the next decade. I mean, we have many of them, but this one is a pretty big one because it impacts many facets of our economy. But to a large extent, in my opinion, obviously there's three levels of jurisdiction: provincial, where all the building permits are issued, and then obviously, landlord-tenant matters are at the provincial level, and then the federal level. But to me, the biggest culprit is at the municipal level. The size of municipalities is excessive, and so on, but also taxes. Um, is this appropriate for you to comment on that? Because I find, that's why we have a housing crisis. It's taken so long, so much red tape to get building permits and all of that. And then you and I mean, my properties are in Edmonton where you live. And boy, I mean, those laneways, when they come and pick up the garbage, are completely destroyed. Like, we're not getting services for the money we're paying. Do you care to comment on that? Because it seems to me you'd be well positioned to comment on that. That's
Yeah, I agree with your sentiment there. And what is interesting is that you often hear in the news council members and politicians talking about zoning. And we're going to allow for this particular multi-fam zone land to be able to do high rises, or we're going to take residential land and say, okay, we're loosening up the bylaw requirements so that you can build 4 stories in the middle of a residential neighborhood, which is great. That's going to allow for increased supply, and we have pretty high demand right now. But where the pain points lie, and where a lot of development stalls, as you were mentioning, is the permits and the bureaucracy of getting the city. I'm going off of mostly our experience here in Edmonton and in Calgary, but we do hear these same sort of thoughts from owners in BC. Is that when the time comes and you need to have the necessary permits come in and approved by the city, you're dealing with 7 different chefs in the kitchen, which each with their own thoughts in terms of what ingredients should be added to the soup or not. And projects just get stalled and they don't move forward. And then people get a little bit frustrated and say, why would I do a new build in order to have an 8-suite rental house when it's going to cost me a lot of money and a lot of time spent dealing with the city? So what could be just you buy a property that's already up and running and off you go. You're now spending 6 months, 8 months trying to go through the bureaucracy of getting everything approved, and that's 8 months where you're not getting any cash flow coming in. So they do have to look at it holistically and say, from start to finish, how can we ensure that a developer or a new entry into the market can purchase either a piece of land or an older building and retrofit it into sort of multi-fam use without the significant delays and just waiting in a queue for someone to kind of put their stamp of approval on it. I don't know if that really answered your question or not.
Well, it does. It does. I mean, you're in agreement with me in a couple of words, a few words. What do you think the solution is to this housing crisis?
Oh, geez. The solution needs to be, I think, a 3-pronged approach. We need to have better supply. And in order to get better supply, we have to incentivize developers to start building, multi-fam units. We've seen some jurisdictions where they have a moratorium on property tax increase over the next 5 years if you build X number of suites. We see other jurisdictions offering rent subsidies up to a certain level. And then we have other jurisdictions that just, offering sort of grants and other sort of, economic incentives. And then we have other jurisdictions that say, well, this is not for us to decide and incentivize new developments being built. The second approach is that we need to look at where we're building and how we're building, and really focus on sort of those key areas within municipalities, so that we have that sort of 15-minute sort of work home life balance. And we're seeing that adjust a little bit here. I think one of our topics was sort of office tower conversion. And we've seen a lot of sort of urban sprawl and sort of newer multifam developments happening away from the city core. And we're seeing a shift in that now. A lot of, partly because of the downturn in the office market. The pandemic was definitely a driver in that, and not a lot of people are wanting to go back working in a downtown office tower, 5 days a week. So they don't need as much office footprint within the downtown cores currently. So they're taking these office buildings and they're retrofitting to, kind of retail on the bottom, multi-fam for a certain portion, and then, office for the remainder. And that's really helping with supply and bringing people sort of back to the central corridors and, willing to rent as opposed to being kind of, sprawled out outside of the major city limits there.
Yeah, that office conversion scheme is not for the faint of heart, right? It's quite a costly endeavor depending on the type of structure you're dealing with. Like this is happening here in downtown Calgary, as you probably know. We had a very high office vacancy rate for like in the 20-30% for many years. Yeah, okay, yeah.
I think the last sort of driver, and the last piece I touch upon is the pandemic scared a lot of multifam investors off. There was a lot of uncertainty in terms of people being able to afford their rent. There was lots of talk from the government about rent controls and rent freezes. Meanwhile, operating expenses were going up and up and up. So,
You tell me.
yeah, exactly.
With the
You
six
went through
properties
that.
I own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of hesitancy to people to get into the multifam market over the last couple of years. And, that has ultimately sort of lowered the supply, and demand is getting higher and higher. I'm sure you get many phone calls about interest rates and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
kind of getting into the rental market because they can't afford mortgages anymore. And then we have, immigration, both sort of internationally and sort of interprovincially, depending on what province you're currently living in. So, that's all increasing demand, and with low supply, that just makes it very difficult right now for anyone to find a reasonably priced 1 or 2 bedroom apartment.
Yeah, I want to go back to that point, and then we can move on to the other topics. But what I find, and I read a ton. I read super fast, and I read a lot about everything, pretty much. But obviously, specifically about housing and the mortgage market and all that.
Mhm.
I find right now in the media, we hear a lot about like rents going up 12, 10%, etc. The one mistake that people who don't know real estate very well make is to put every market in the same bucket, and every market is different. For example, you and I know fully well in Alberta, for example, for the last year in 2023 was the first year that many of us landlords were able to give rent increases. And as you
Mhm.
said, while our operating expenses kept going up, we know what inflation's been like.
Mhm.
But also, I find the media looking for sensationalism
Mhm.
are making the landlords look really bad. They're increasing the
Mhm.
rents, but we have to keep operating. These are all business entities that we have to
Mhm.
pay for heating and gas and lighting the place and etc. Inflation is hitting us really hard, and people forget that many of us have not been able to increase our rents. At least that was the case, I would say, in
Mhm.
Saskatchewan and Alberta for quite many years.
Yeah, totally. CMHC, their latest 2023 year-end report, it was pretty surprising. Historically, we all know Toronto, Vancouver, they've always
Yeah.
been doing pretty well. They've kind of had their own little sort of market areas going up. And the rest of the cities throughout Canada have historically been around 10 to 15% sort of the rental rates that you see in Vancouver and Toronto. Again, like you said, depending on location and market area, but just generally the rest of Canada is not too far behind Vancouver and Toronto. At the end of 2023, Vancouver and Toronto was about 47% ahead of the other major cities throughout Canada, and that was
47%.
47%. So
Wow.
that's not a historic gap in terms of how far ahead Vancouver and Toronto. And when you look at the report and sort of their predictions, again, this is CMHE, this is not a CVG study or opinion,
Yeah.
that they're not anticipating that Vancouver and Toronto are going to decrease in order to shorten that gap. They're anticipating that these other cities are eventually, over the next 12 months, 18 months, are going to be able to bridge that gap and get close to about maybe 7 to 10% below Vancouver and Toronto levels. And we're already starting to see that here in Western Canada. And you look at Calgary in the last 8 months, they've had about a 14% increase to their rental rates. So they're well on their way to closing that gap at 47%.
I'm in that boat, if I may say. I've
Mhm.
got one property at 16% rent increases and another one 12%. So they range between that. But again, we have not been able to increase our rents for like a good 6 years prior to last year. So
Yeah, and you hear that, and I guess I agree with the media are saying, well, you have people saying, well, I was only at $800 a month. It's like, well, that's you've been on that for 20 years, like it's we
yep.
have to, kind of adjust for, the cost of dollar, living allowances and inflation. And, at the end of the day, owners need to realize that profit because, they're not in this to just, lose money. You want to gain a return on your real estate investment.
Yeah, like I said, I'm glad that we have the chance to talk about this, Gary, because I think it's one-sided a lot in the media, what people hear about it. And the other aspect that you and I can talk about, tenants don't necessarily take good care of their units. So there's a lot of damage there that occur when they move in and when they move out. And yeah, but anyway, I don't want to get on a rant here because that's an easy thing, especially on a Friday afternoon for you and I.
Mhm.
We haven't had
Yeah.
our drink at the end of the week. Yeah, I find generally speaking in Canada since 2015, I'll leave it at that. You can see why that's a pretty important date for Canada's gone down the drain. It is not an environment very conducive to doing business, whatever the kind of business that you're in. But certainly, you can take it from me, the landlording business is particularly difficult. Gary, so give us at a high level. I have to admit, you're ahead of me in the game because I haven't looked at CMHC's report that just came out, the rental market survey. But I think the gist is that the highlight is rents are increasing and vacancies are coming down. What's the national average? Do you know? I think it's 1.1%, the national vacancy rate right now, something like that. Do you know off the top of your head? I'm
Yeah,
putting you on the spot, but if you don't have
one
it, that's
yeah,
okay. But
1.3, I believe, is
yeah, it's in
what
that
I saw.
vicinity. Yeah,
And
exactly.
we have areas where it's below 0.5%, which is like,
Well, of
the
course.
first time ever, like in some of these places where they historically run at 3 or 4% and now they're below 1%.
Yeah.
So, it almost feels like, kind of with the tech boom and, some of these other booms we've had along the way, that the multifamily boom, similar to kind of what we saw, I think, in 2004 or so. I think a lot of investors are looking at that multifam market and, willing to jump in.
Yeah, it's going to happen now. I'm going to put, what I teach, I should have gotten those hats out. But when I teach my course, because I teach, as you may, I think you know, Gary, right? I've got a 3-day workshop. I wear different hats. Now I'm going to wear my mortgage broker hat. Yeah, I think people once interest rates come down and because of the numbers, the Bank of Canada wants to make sure that the inflation has been tamed. We're looking at interest rate cuts at the beginning of the summer of 2024. But I think, and I'm gambling on it, that's one of the reasons why I became a mortgage broker specializing in apartment buildings. We're going to have a significant boom because, as I said, this is one of the biggest challenges that Canada has. And now that I'm on the financing side of it, we've got programs like CMHC MLI Select, that's there to spur affordable housing. But the cost of money is still pretty high. So I think my prediction, and I think it's a very safe bet, once those interest rates start dropping, you're going to see a lot of construction. And as much as I know about construction to some extent in my days at CMHC, but since there hasn't been a lot, when in my days at CMHC, there weren't too many construction deals going on. But I suspect a major construction boom, but also because it's such a huge challenge for this country, I expect many more programs, as you were talking about, like every jurisdiction has a few programs like that, but we're going to start seeing additional programs because, but the biggest thing that concerns me at this point is I don't see a sense of urgency. We see it from the federal government, but I don't see it as much from the municipalities again, which I think are the culprit number one in this housing crisis, to be honest with you. And but I definitely expect a major housing boom. And for me, I'm hoping to partner up with investors and get into the construction business. But yes, it's starting to happen. Um, it's very interesting that in the suggested topics that you mentioned, anticipating investor behavior. What do you see there from your perspective? And you specifically have an opinion, I believe, about Alberta and Saskatchewan. So what are the REITs? And the REITs are real estate investment trusts. What are they doing? What do you see happening?
They are high-tailing it out of Alberta. And, they came in about 2018, 2019, bought up, I think it was something about 35% of Alberta inventory in 2018, 2019 was bought up by REITs. In some areas, I think it was closer to 45% or so. And historically, they're about 10 to 15%. So a lot of REITs from out east came in 2018, 2019, bought up a lot of multifam properties here in Alberta. And they
Gary, sorry to interrupt, but what size property? And are we talking, can we name names? Are we talking about Boardwalk, Main Street? Can we name names? Is it appropriate or not?
Yeah, those players, Killam REITs, and some of those key players that we typically see kind of in the BC and sort of East Coast.
And what
Um,
size properties? Usually those guys go for the larger properties, right?
yeah,
They're
we're
not.
talking like the smallest would probably be around a 30 unit, 40 unit,
Okay.
all the way up to 100 units or so. And I'll explain to, I guess that does impact the low walk-up multifam properties. But we are seeing them look at Saskatoon, especially, is sort of the next hotspot. A lot of activity happening in Saskatoon right now from these REITs. And they're for the most part, they hold on to assets, but typically like to come in, buy low, wait for the market to rebound, sell high, and then go on to the next place where they can kind of just, rinse and repeat. So, we're seeing, at least here in Alberta, the sentiment that the multifam market is, quite strong and it's a good time to sell. I would probably disagree a little bit. I think we're not quite at the peak yet. I think, we've seen a little bit of gains, but we're not at the point where I think I would, cash in and take the money and run. But I don't run a REIT, and they're a lot smarter than I am. So
Yeah,
they see something within their own modeling that they're thinking it's a good time to sell Hill in Alberta and get into Saskatoon.
Yeah, if they came in the 2018, 2019, as you said, but as we mentioned, right, we weren't, our NOIs, our net operating incomes, which drive valuation, weren't increasing for quite a few years. So, but yeah, I'm smaller. My largest, as you know, Gary, is 38 suiter, and but yeah, I'm thinking about cashing out, but not quite yet. Just because we've had those stable, those constant NOIs, and so value appreciation has not delivered yet. So
Yeah,
now we've
well,
got the big lift with these rent increases, because people should know, if they follow me, that your best friend when you invest in a multifamily property, and I say this over and over throughout my 3D workshop, is NOI, net operating income, because you've got a multiplier effect,
yeah.
roughly depending on the cap rate in your market area. If you increase your rent by $1, the property can appreciate, I don't know, $25. It's quite
Mhm.
significant, depending on the cap rates. The more compressed the cap rates are,
Mhm.
but yeah, it's going to be an interesting world. But for sure, we need to do more to build more. So those guys uh, and what do you see in terms of so what's attracting them to come out west?
Yeah,
Is what the prospects of the economy are looking good, I would say.
no, I think what we saw in Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal with how uh sales were really inflated due to the strong supply and demand over the last few years is that to buy a, let's say, a $5 million apartment multifam property here in Alberta is a lot different in terms of what you'd be able to purchase within Victoria, let's say, or Toronto. So you can spend the same amount of capital, but then you have a property that will give you better cash flow coming in because you can buy a bigger property for that same purchasing power as you would elsewhere. Um, and we're due to, I guess, them, they kind of come, it's kind of like a shock and awe. They come in, they buy all these properties, they really drive up the prices, and it scares off a lot of local investors as a result because they just don't have the pockets or the ability to compete with the REIT. If a REIT wants a property, they're going to get that property.
Well, they buy it cash, right? I mean, one particular REIT, I know, I don't know. Well, I won't mention the name, but they buy cash on 80 cents at 80 cents on the dollar, right? So
Yeah,
it's hard to
yeah,
compete in us
exactly, and
without
so.
mentioning names, but
Mhm. So what is actually nice about them, at least, I'm saying this from, I live in Alberta, so I'm saying this from an Albertan perspective, is that with the REITs leaving the market now, it really allows local investors and people to sort of start purchasing again and not having to compete with these REITs coming in and kind of, kiboshing any sort of deal because they can, as you said, they can offer whatever amount they want to offer. And, as a local investor, you just can't compete with that.
so let's backtrack a little bit, Gary. You're telling me, so they came in the 2019 or 2018, 2019, they're leaving now. That's what you're seeing happening.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
But yet, isn't that contrarian? Like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, and we don't have to agree on these podcasts. We can all have our own opinions.
Mhm.
But to me, Alberta's prospects are really, really good. So why would the REITs leave? Just because? Well, you said it too. Actually, you did say it. It's because of their business model, right? They have to give dividends back to their shareholders, and the best way to capture all the equity and the value appreciation is by selling, which is a different model than mine. I'm a long-term holder, and I'm in it for the legacy, and my shareholders are the same, right?
Mhm.
But
Yeah, and some REITs, they are just holding on. They're just no longer actively buying. So, they came in, they bought what they
okay.
wanted, and now they're holding on to their assets. And then they're moving on to, like I said, Saskatoon is kind of where the hotspot is right now. So they're moving into Saskatoon, and they can leverage, if they don't have, the cash, the financing, and the difference of the equity they have in their properties now, and can buy, further properties. But I'll give you an example in terms of kind of what we see from the REITs versus what we see from local investors. And we have 2018, where I'll use kind of a 4-level walk up. We had a few REITs going in and paying about 185 per door, so 185,000 per door is what they were buying up from. And again, investors, local investors, like, well, that's too much money. We can't afford those kind of prices, or maybe we don't want to pay those kind of prices. And again, I think it typically stems from, they have $5 million they want to spend, and this is what they're willing to spend in order to get, whatever property they're looking for. Anyways, that property is now being bought, not that, a similar property, I should say, is now being purchased for about 135 per door by local investors, and it's just because the market is cooling, just because of the whole, supply and demand aspect. And, there's, so, it's interesting when REITs come in, they buy fast, they buy hard, and really drives up prices. And then by the time they move on to the next hotspot, prices seem to cool, and local investors kind of get back into the market.
That's very interesting. I'm glad to hear about that. Yeah, I'm very glad. It's people should know, when they come out, not British Columbia, certainly not Lower Mainland, but Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatoon, Regina, they're small markets. So those REITs, when they come into the market, they have a major impact. Which for little guys like me, I consider myself a small landlord. Obviously, it can be hard because you got to compete with them. You got to know your market very well, and the kind of amenities that they offer versus yours. But the REITs usually, depending which REIT, obviously, caliber REIT, I would say, right, Gary? Some of them, like you said, they paid, like in your example, 185 a door, $185,000 a door. I'm assuming that was a newer building, clearly,
Yeah.
given the price per door. But yeah, you gotta the point I want people to understand when they come out west, it's a smaller world. There's not a ton of players. It's not like a Toronto or a Vancouver, and that's, as an investor, you need to factor that in. Just to go
Yeah.
back to what I was saying earlier, what's happened in Alberta in particular, right, Gary? You know full well we had to give rental incentives for a long time. Like me in particular, and
Mhm.
people with a portfolio of the size of mine, to compete with those REITs.
Mhm.
So you gotta factor that risk into your
Yeah,
investment
and to,
strategy.
kind of circle back to kind of the work we do, is that, someone gets their assessment notice and they get the details and they're saying, 185 per door. There's no way I'd be able to get, 185 per door.
Exactly.
And, the city looks at their cells and say, well, here's a whole bunch of cells. at 185 per door. But then it's like these are all REITs, coming in. Again, they're not really looking at what is fair market value per se. They're just looking at we want to buy a building for $5 million, and this is sort of the cash flow and income flow we want as a result of that. And they'll go out and find it, and so it is interesting how these REITs can kind of swing sort of valuations from sort of one extreme to the next as a result of sort of their purchasing power. And it's tough to argue in the city and say, well, this is not the market when the market is REITs coming in and buying these properties. So it
Yeah.
will.
Yeah, it wouldn't have this kind of harsh impact if it were a larger center like GTA or Toronto or Vancouver. So I just, from experience, I wanted to share that so that people, because, it's kind of like West now, we're kind of like Klondike of investors, multifamily investors, right? I don't want you to name names, but some people have kind of had made a bit of a harsh discovery, a rude awakening. Have you have any stories without mentioning the investors, but have you got wind of a few stories like that? People coming, say, from Toronto, thinking they're going to strike gold and, kind of learning some hard lessons. Any anecdote that would put context to this?
Yeah, good question.
That's okay if you
Yeah,
cannot think.
nothing that comes off the top of my head. I think, kind of what we typically see with, problems being encountered is competing, I guess, with where the rental rate market is at right now. And, they say, okay, well, right now, Toronto's at, let's say 1,600 for, one bedroom or, two bedroom, depending on, again, the location. So we're going to come in and offer $1,500 in Edmonton because, that's a fair price. And it's like, well, the market within Edmonton or Calgary, it's $1,200, and so they have to, again, look at these incentives to bring in new tenants, and they really cut down on their margins as a result of that. So I think it's a lot of bit not willing to take maybe a couple of years of slim margins or taking a little bit of a loss, knowing that probably in 3-4 years from now, you will be able to get to that. Well, it could be even sooner. Could be able to get to that $1,400, $1,500 per month rental rate. So I think patience comes into play here. I think as investors, right now, we are seeing a resurgence of the multifam market, but it's no means we're in that flip territory where you can buy in and 6 months from now, flip it, right? You have to be patient, and you have to be willing to have those pain points along the way in terms of ever increasing op costs, property tax, dealing with tenants who are having a hard time being able to keep up with where the market is at. But if you can get through probably the next couple of years or so, I think you'll be glad you did, in that you were able to just to hold the line and stay with those properties until we get to that point where we close that gap between Vancouver and Toronto.
Well, I'm counting on it, Gary. I'm counting on it. That's it's been a painful journey, very painful journey. What else? I think we've covered a lot of the topics we wanted to talk about. You've got here one topic you mentioned is strong demand for 3-story walk-ups, like the kind of buildings I own. Essentially, is that what you're saying here?
Yeah, I think we're really seeing a emergence now of these 8 to 10 bedroom suites within the marketplace. Now, depending, I guess, the size of your lot, that 3-story could easily be 20-25 suites. But what we typically saw again in the last maybe 3 years or so was major developers building high rises, and you wouldn't really see a lot of smaller developments from developers, and that has shifted over the last, I'd say, about maybe 12 to 18 months or so, where developers are buying sort of a couple of lots and then building the smaller unit types of properties. And I think that's a little bit with investor behavior. I think consumer behavior. If you're looking at kind of what people want within multifam right now, they're happy to be a tenant in a place that has a little bit of character, has a little bit of charm, and has a little bit of sense of community, I suppose, where you're living with maybe 8 or 10 other people in a little microcosm there, as opposed to living in these sort of large complex where you don't really kind of know your neighbors. So we kind of seen that shift a little bit, where it's a little bit more smaller developments, but a little bit more catered towards the community aspect than some of these previous larger developments.
Very interesting. That's something I wasn't aware of. That's very interesting. Yeah. Okay. All right. Gary, just before we wrap it up, so what other services do you guys offer at CVG, at Canadian Valuation Group, over and above? Are there any other services other than appealing taxes, people's taxes? Is there other
No,
services that
yeah, I know
people,
we got a lot of calls for sort of insurance appraisals and finance appraisals and stuff like that. And property tax appeals keeps us quite busy.
but
And so yeah, that's our unlike other firms that are competitors, I suppose, that offer accounting services and appraisal services. Yeah, we're strictly
but
property
do
tax
you do
appeals.
insurance appraisals or you don't? You don't, eh?
We don't know. We just don't have the
Okay.
time, and I guess that's probably a point of consideration for me is bringing on some appraisers that can do that work. We definitely have frequent phone calls around that line.
Okay.
But we kind of try to focus on property tax appeals, a very niche market, and that's what we're good at. Um, you know,
Yeah, well, that's what you specialize in. I appreciate your services every year. So every year we have a chat. So Gary, they can reach you at Gary Smith with one R at the CVG.ca, which
that's
stands
correct.
for
Yeah, yeah.
Canada Evaluation Group. So again, Gary with one R, Gary Smith at the CVG.ca. And I'll put your credentials below as well. Can you think of anything else before we wrap
No, I
this
guess
post
I'll
up?
just close with, if you're out on the East Coast, just if you're doing budget this year, just plan for a little bit of an increase with your
Yeah.
P-tax budget next year. I think it's going to be probably almost doubled. And
Wow.
if you're anywhere else in the country and you're questioning whether or not you're being taxed fairly and reasonably, just give me a call and I'll be happy to have a chat to see if you're being taxed accordingly.
Yeah, and again, that's for people out in Ontario as well. So, and you said British Columbia, Alberta, and did you say Manitoba? I believe you said. And how about Saskatchewan? Obviously, you're in Saskatchewan as well.
Yeah, we're coast to coast for the most part, so
Okay,
we're
cool.
slowly getting there. But yeah, we have the ability to challenge any appeal located in Canada, and happy to do so.
Awesome. Well, Gary, thank you so much. Before I finish this post, I encourage the viewers, the subscribers to go and take a look at my website at multifamilyinvestingcanada.com, Mick, multifamilyinvestingcanada.com. You'll find out when the next workshop is, and if I have master classes we teach, that's free training. Um, I can tell you, so this is, we're early 2024 here, February 23rd, and I'm super stoked for me, for many aspects. First of all, as a mortgage broker, there's a lot that we need to build. Like CMC came out last year with, or a couple of years ago with an estimate that we were short by 3.5 million affordable housing units, but then they forgot that they let in over 1 million immigrants, and so the number is more like at least 5 million. It's probably even more. But I still believe it's not an easy business, as Gary was pointing out. It's not an overnight get rich kind of business. We all
Mhm.
have different business models, but that's certainly mine. I'm in it for the long run. And like I said, I don't mind saying that I have some scars to prove it, that it's not always an easy business to
Mhm.
be in. But I think the future looks bright because and this is a former CEO. I don't know if you know this, Gary, a former CEO of my former employer, Evan Siddall, used to be CEO of CMHC a few years back. And Canada is becoming a nation of renters, just like Quebec, for instance, is, and most countries around the world, to be honest with you.
Mhm.
We took home ownership for granted. Unfortunately, for your kids, your daughters, and my three kids, Gary, we're gonna have to pitch in if we want
Mhm.
them to become homeowners to help them
All
out.
right.
Because, but the
Mhm.
point is, I think the future of multifamily investing is great. I'm specializing in new construction, so I'm super stoked to work with investors. So if this is up your alley, this is something you want to do, you can reach out to me. I'll put my credentials again, or my email is pturgeon at maoki.ca. That's my new email. as a mortgage broker, but more to come on that. I'll do an official launch. So once again, Gary, thank you so much for spending a portion of your Friday afternoon. Now you can go and have your gin and tonic if that's your beverage of choice. Certainly is mine. I should put a couple glasses for when my wife gets back from work. What's your beverage of choice, by the way, Gary?
Oh, I like Scotch.
Oh, yeah.
Scotch is my choice, and I'm starting to dabble in bourbon a little bit. So I'm really enjoying some of the craft bourbon that's out there right now.
All right. Well, I'll look you up. Maybe we can hook up for lunch next time I'm in Edmonton. That'll be soon, actually. So, all right. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for
Thank
having
you for
me.
watching.
And yeah, it was a great chat. It was hopefully somewhat informative for your listeners. And yeah, I guess give Pierre Paul a call. Like Saskatoon, kind of Edmonton, get those multifam properties purchased because yeah, I think we'll see some pretty good gains on those over the next 3 to 4 years.
That's a great tip. Yeah, definitely. All right. Thank you so much, Gary.
Hey,
Have
guys.
a great weekend. Cheers.
Goodbye.